In the UK, the public-private partnership took a different form. The form in which the PPP developed in the UK is known as the PFI, Project Finance Initiative, launched by the Thatcher administration and followed by all of its successors since then. General idea of the PFI was to finance any infrastructure, be it social or economic, through the involvement of, on one hand, the public sector, and on the other hand, the private sector. Public sector would act as a regulator, whilst the private sector would act as a service provider, a contractor. In this particular scheme, the regulator allows the private sector to benefit from a monopolistic situation for a relatively long period of time, 20, 25 years, 30 years, in exchange of a payment stream made by the government to the private sector, to the extent this private sector has rendered the service in accordance to the specification of the contract. Deductions, penalties could be applied if the operator is missing some of its undertaking that he has already agreed on the contract. The PFI system was applied to infrastructure like hospitals, prisons and schools, for which we can conceivably admit that only the public sector could finance it. Typically, the private sector in this particular role would commit to ensure the renovation and the operation of the facilities at a cost that will be covered by the public sector. Typically, the government would pay a compensation to the operator. This compensation is supposed to cover, first of all, the operating cost of the renovation, plus the financing cost, and a decent return on the sponsor's equity. The PFI was also applied to infrastructure which is an economic infrastructure, like the tramway system, the toll roads, the bridges, the airports, the ports. Some of those projects were financed by a mix of public involvement and private involvement, public funding and private funding. It was typically the case of the transport sector, like the tram systems and the airports, where the users' fees were mixed with the government compensation system. Some other sectors, like motorways, were developed under the so-called shadow toll system, also developed in Portugal and Spain, where users don't pay when they take the infrastructure, but rather through their taxes, levied by the central government. In this case, the central government will pay a fee to the operator for the purpose of covering the operating cost of the road and also the maintenance of this road. This system of funding helped a lot in the development of the infrastructures in countries where the gap was large. In fact, it allowed lower funding costs as the government was often seen by the lenders as the ultimate risk in these transactions. It also allowed a larger acceptability by the population compared to situations where the infrastructure would have been financed or told by the private sector. France decided to embrace this model 20 years ago and called it the PPP model, public-private partnership. It spread it over all these sectors of the economy, be it economic or social infrastructure, even though in reality energy type deals like oil, gas, electricity continued to be privately funded. Several degrees of risk transfer to the private sector exist. It can start with private sector contribution, like developer contribution through the land, to partnership arrangement, we call it quality partnerships, to concession scheme like design, build, finance and operates, which under the French system we know as concession. Ultimately, it can even go through to privatization, which is full or partial ownership transfer from the public to the private sector. This public-private sector divide is between ultimately the provision of services to the public, we call it the public procurement on one side, and to the DBFO, BOT system on the other side. PFI is finally a formidable tool to allow cash flow predictability and visibility hence participating in the reduction of the financing cost of the infrastructure.